for an important matter of order and decorum, and will assert my responsibility to preserve order and decorum with respect to the wearing of masks. Chair would greatly prefer that all present simply uphold the decorum of the committee by complying with reasonable safety standards that are recommended by the attending physician and respectful of all the occupants of the room, and this is because half the people in America are refusing to get vaccines, and a bunch of people won't tell us whether they've been vaccinated. So here we are. I call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule F, House Rule 11-2H4, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question approving any measure or matter adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote and yeas, nays are ordered, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess in any time. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 30954, Fair and Open Skies Act, H.R. 1339, Advanced Air Mobility Coordination Leadership Act, H.R. 3193, E-Bridge Act, H.R. 23037, Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act of 2021, H.R. 3709, Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act of 2021, H.R. 4679 to designate federal building located at 1200 New Jersey Avenue, Southeast Washington, D.C. as the Norman Yoshio Mineta Federal Building, H.R. 4660 to designate the federal building, United States Courthouse, located at 1125 Chaplain Street in Wheeling, West Virginia, as the Frederick P. Stamp Jr. Federal Building, United States Courthouse, H.R. 2220 to amend Title 40 U.S. Code to modify the treatment of certain bargain price options to purchase at less than fair market value, or whatever that means. H. Conres 41, authorizing the use of Capitol grounds, National Peace Office Memorial Service, National Honor Guard Pipe Band Exhibition, General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program Resolution. As a reminder, for those of you online, please keep your microphones muted. To insert a document in the record, please have your staff email it to documents@mail.us.gov. And finally, any bill or amendment text has been distributed electronically. All bill and amendment text has been distributed electronically according to the rules. The first item in consideration is H.R. 3095, Fair and Open Skies Act. Without objection, the Committee on Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 3095, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on 3095. I'm pleased today to bring up for consideration H.R. 3095, the Bipartisan Fair and Open Skies Act, which seeks to prevent a race to the bottom in international civil aviation. We have seen that. It happened to the cruise line industry. And we don't want to emulate that, and aviation lose the good paying jobs and lose airlines that are based in the United States of America and contribute tremendously to our economy. Norwegian Air International popped up several years ago. I led the fight in the House to defeat it. It was Norwegian name only. It had an Irish Air Operator Certificate, employing crews on short-term contracts governed under Singapore law, didn't pay them competitively with long-haul crew members at other airlines. The flight attendants were similarly contracted for and were not employees, and again, were underpaid compared to other international airlines. Unfortunately, in December 16, the Obama administration granted them a foreign air carrier permit over the protests of 175 bipartisan members of Congress who joined me in co-sponsoring a bill to stop Norwegian. I believe they did that because they were pushing their EU free trade agreement, and they didn't want to upset the apple cart. Of course, they never got the free trade agreement, but they managed to give this airline a wedge into the U.S. market by ignoring the existing agreement between the EU, Iceland, and the United States of America, which Ireland is not a part of. And then I sent a letter to President-elect Trump asking him to reverse the decision. I talked to his so-called economic advisor, Kudlow, and he thought this was great. It was competition, so they never took any action. It's not competition when you have a flag of convenience, a substandard carrier paying substandard wages, employing people on contract, and ultimately I believe it would lead not only to anti-competitiveness and undermining a great industry in the United States of America, but also ultimately I believe it would have resulted in issues regarding safety. So the Fair and Open Skies Act won't undo the damage that's been done, but Norwegian Air is history, thankfully. This bill is pretty simple. Prohibits the issuance of a foreign air carrier permit to any future airline seeking to fly the United States that subverts the strongest U.S. European labor standards, fair competition, consistent with our current international air transport agreement, the U.S.-EU Norway-Iceland Transport Agreement. Second, it states unequivocally that preventing a foreign airline from exploiting a flag of convenience or otherwise undermining labor standards is in the public interest. Kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes the bureaucrats or people with another agenda forget that. The threat is real. There's another airline proposed thus far. He's saying, well, he's not going to follow that model, but there's nothing to say someone else won't pop up, or there's nothing at this point binding on that particular airline, even though they have entered into agreement with the Association of Flight Attendants. So to have these protections in place, from what I've been told, haven't talked to the gentleman, he says he's going to observe all these rules. Well, great, then he shouldn't have any problem with this bill. We had 156 co-sponsors last year. I want to thank Rick Larson, Chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, Sharice Davids, Vice Chair of the Committee, Connor Lamb, Kai Kahale, Rodney Davis, Drew Ferguson, Bill Johnson, Don Bacon, and Jack Bergman, and others who are already co-sponsors of the bill. Look forward to continuing the work this Congress advance this important legislation, protect U.S. jobs and our nation's international airlines. I urge my colleagues to join me, the aviation workforce, in supporting H.R. 3095. I recognize now Ranking Member Graves for a statement. Do say you can take off a mask while you're talking, which I'll probably do next time because that got a little bit much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing up this bill, and I want to be clear that I think every member of this committee supports the intent of the legislation, myself included. There's no doubt, as you and I have worked together on the maritime industry to try to ensure that U.S. carriers are at a level playing field, we don't want to see the same evolution in aviation as we've seen happen in the maritime industry and some of the battles that we've had over the years there. No one wants foreign air carriers using loopholes to relocate to countries like Liberia, Panama, and directly compete against U.S. carriers, U.S. companies, and paying pennies on the dollars to their flight attendants, pilots, and others. No one wants U.S. air carriers to be put at a competitive disadvantage. And like you, I've heard from all sorts of folks from all sides of this issue and have had some very valuable input. I know that some of that has been reflected in the legislation. But because of all the feedback we've heard, the ranking member, Sam Graves, and I did ask the Department of Transportation to provide technical assistance. And that feedback was sent to the Big Four, as you know. And the Department of Transportation, I want to be clear, under this administration did point out that the bill could put the Department of Transportation in the position of taking actions that foreign countries may allege are contrary to U.S. obligations under international agreements. Further, they state that this could trigger retaliatory actions by America's foreign aviation partners and expose the United States to legal and diplomatic challenge, which could include lengthy and costly arbitration. They explained the bill would require to determine the intent of commercial decisions by foreign air carriers in deciding where to establish their operations. Let me say that again. it could actually force the department to require a determination for the intent of commercial decisions by foreign air carriers. So this is sort of getting in someone's head and trying to decide, trying to understand how they made a decision or why. It notes that were the Department of Transportation engaged in such inquiries, foreign governments could feel comparatively entitled to examine the intent behind U.S. companies' commercial decision-making, which obviously would cause, I think, heartburn among many of us on this committee. The department warns that the EU, as well as non-EU foreign partners, will not hesitate to retaliate against U.S. carriers, and retaliation could include imposing their own conditions on U.S. carriers with potentially, quote, potentially significant costs that carriers would in turn pressure them to reduce overall employment, or, quote, limiting the ability of U.S. carriers to obtain new operating authority or to renew existing authority. The risk of retaliation is very real. Last week, the European Union sent a letter raising serious concerns and stating the bill would result in clear violation of the U.S.-EU Air Transport Agreement. And the letter, the EU makes clear that H.R. 3095, if enacted, would have no other option but to take necessary measures to protect its rights under the agreement. Finally, the concerns about how the bill might impact our standing in future trade negotiations. I want to be clear. I fully support the intent of this legislation, and Mr. Chairman, I want to be clear on that. I fully support the intent of this legislation, and we do need to learn from some of the painful mistakes and battles that we fought together in the maritime industry. But I also want to make sure that we have this objective that we share of having a level playing field. I do wonder if some of these concerns raised by the EU and Department of Transportation could more fully or explicitly be addressed. And I know in your opening statement you noted that it is your intent to not run afoul of those international agreements or the concerns that were raised. So I just ask if you'd be willing to work together with us as we move forward to address concerns raised by Department of Transportation, the EU, and others to make sure that that the legislation doesn't do anything that I think neither one of us intend.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I'd be happy after we move the bill out before we go to the floor to have discussions. But we are saying it should be compliant with the existing agreements. They threatened this before with Norwegian Air, which was not compliant with the existing agreement. They threatened us the same way. And then, of course, I know there's a lot of pressure from UPS and FedEx who fear that somehow this is going to hurt their access to markets. All of this is unfounded, and any complaints that were brought for us complying with our international agreement, I believe, would be unfounded and would be dismissed. But I'd be happy to further discuss the concerns of the bureaucrats at DOT. With that, I yield to Rick Larsen. Well, okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I do want to reiterate that I think in your opening statements, you made clear that it wasn't your intent to run afoul of some of those agreements, and these aren't just concerns that we've heard. These are concerns from this administration, and so I do thank you for the commitment to work with us, and look forward to doing that as this bill moves forward. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Larsen.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio, for holding the markup today on any number of bills, but certainly including this particular one. And as chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, I'm really pleased that legislation before the committee includes bills to strengthen the U.S. aviation and aerospace sectors to improve our global competitiveness and ensure the future of the sector remains bright. So I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 3095, the Fair and Open Skies Act. I'm looking toward the future of aviation and aerospace, and I know that it means creating jobs and improving the nation's competitiveness in the global market. This bipartisan bill states unequivocally that the U.S. will not reward countries that break their commitments to protect working women and men. And passing this bill will also send a clear message that Congress supports the best aerospace and aviation workforce in the world by preventing airlines from using flags of convenience to circumvent strong labor laws and safety regulations. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 3095 and I yield back. Thank you.
Unless Mr. Graves wants to change hats and be recognized again, I'd look to recognize anyone else on the Republican side. Anyone online? Not hearing anybody? Okay, hearing none. Representative Kahale. Recognized for 5 minutes. All right.
Aloha, Mr. Chairman, and mahalo for yielding me the time to speak. Chair DeFazio, Chair Larson, thank you for spearheading this critical aviation legislation. The legislation presented before us allows for the opportunity to promote the protection of American jobs from unfair competition, codifies American safety standards for passengers, and prohibits foreign air carriers from circumventing the rules of aviation. As an active commercial air transport pilot, I have firsthand experience in understanding the rigorous training and evaluations required of every U.S. pilot, crew member, and air carrier to operate. As a country, we pride ourselves on operating one of the safest aviation systems in the world, thus permitting foreign airlines to systemically ignore standard regulations and labor requirements could deteriorate the level of safety measures that currently exist within the American airline community. As travel has started to bounce back since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, this bipartisan bill would ensure the welfare of our constituents and safeguards the future of aviation. This critical legislation would uphold job security while ensuring the airline industry remains competitive in the international market. Various foreign airlines operating as flag of convenience carriers are exploiting this characterization and avoiding their home country's tax, labor, and safety regulations. It is crucial to terminate these atypical practices which are undermining and abusing American workers and labor standards. I'm a proud co-sponsor and strongly support the Fair and Open Skies Act to ensure that any foreign airline seeking to serve the United States abides by our standards and upholds the integrity of our aviation industry. I'm proud to see this bill being brought before the full committee. I give it my full support and ask my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wishing to be heard in general debate? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. Are there any amendments to H.R. 3095? Okay, hearing none. The question is on the adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 3095 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
I forgot to give the people online a warning. Let's try it again. Okay. If you're unmuted and you're going to say aye, okay, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay. Okay, mute. Those opposed, unmute. Signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered, reported favorably to the House. We are now on to H.R. 1339, Advanced Air Mobility Coordination Leadership Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Aviation discharge further consideration of H.R. 1339. Call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Representative Davids has an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339, offered by Ms. Davids of Kansas, number 010.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Representative Davids, Vice Chair of the full committee, for a statement on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for considering H.R. 1339, the Advanced Air Mobility Coordination and Leadership Act, during today's markup. This bipartisan bill, co-led by myself and Aviation Ranking Member Garrett Graves, seeks to set the groundwork for a new and emerging sector of our economy. H.R. 1339 is a simple and common sense measure. It directs the Department of Transportation to establish an Advanced Air Mobility Interagency Working Group. This group will plan and coordinate efforts related to the safety infrastructure, physical security, cybersecurity, and federal investment necessary to bolster the AAM ecosystem in the United States. The working group will include a wide representation from executive agencies, public and private sector stakeholders, and labor groups who will all begin discussions about what the future of AAM in our country should look like. The potential benefit of a new sector of our transportation economy isn't lost on anyone. Even the most conservative estimates predict that this will be a $1.5 trillion market by 2040. For states like mine, that's important. For areas like Wichita, Kansas, the aviation capital of the world, rich in workforce, plant, and generations of institutional knowledge of aerospace, this sector represents a chance to create good-paying jobs right here at home and in an innovative space. Even in Kansas City, we're home to up and downstream suppliers that stand to benefit from an entirely new market. So we aren't going to sit back and watch this opportunity pass us by or watch others become a dominant player in the AAM space. The U.S. aerospace industry is cutting edge, and we have the tools right in front of us to advance this emerging technology. Ranking Member Graves and I recognize that chance to encourage innovation through common sense legislation, and our colleagues have a companion bill in the Senate. Hopefully, we can lay the foundation for how the federal government can work with and promote advanced air mobility, setting us up for continued growth and innovation in the American aviation space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm strongly support H.R. 1339, the Advanced Air Mobility Coordination and Leadership Act. The bill would create a federal interagency task force, working group to marshal the resources of the federal government and ensure that when advanced air mobility or AAM that the industry is set to fly, that the government is ready. Mr. Chairman, this technology is transformative. It is disruptive. The sole goal of this bill is making sure that that is positive disruption. This is changing, potentially, moving in a direction of changing from taking cars and cabs to literally flying from one place to another. It is going to revolutionize the way that we do infrastructure planning. And it is critical that we have the federal government get in front of this to make sure that we stay ahead of industry, that we are able to lay the runway for this technology to move forward. Did you catch that pun? Mr. Chairman, we often are being reactive or responsive to crises that occur, being reactive or responsive to what's happening with technology, what's happening in the private sector. This bill is an exciting opportunity, and I want to thank Ms. Davids for her leadership and vision on this. It's exciting because this gives us an opportunity to get ahead of the curve, to ensure that our regulatory system, that our planning is in place prior to the evolution of this technology to full commercialization. I truly believe that this advanced air mobility provides unlimited promise to our urban, suburban, and rural communities. Has the technology to connect cities, towns, and communities across the United States by reimagining our air transportation system as a part of our everyday lives, to the point to where, just like you order a Uber or Lyft ride on your phone, you could potentially do the same with this in flying instead of driving. A Deloitte study this year found that the AAM industry in the United States could reach $115 billion by 2035, employing 280,000 people. It's an exciting opportunity to connect communities. In my state, folks in Baton Rouge could hop on an electric vertical takeoff and landing or eVTOL aircraft and travel to New Orleans for business or fun. Let's be honest, fun. Without having to sit in traffic on Interstate 10, which is often backed up. Energy workers could reach the Gulf of Mexico energy platforms quickly, quietly, safely, and cheaply. The Department of Defense has realized the potential for eVTOL aircraft and to revolutionize its own operations here in the United States and abroad, which is why it's investing heavily in the Agility Prime program to foster the AAM industry. But challenges are in front of us. Issues relating to aircraft certification, ground infrastructure, air traffic control, battery storage, cybersecurity, physical security, spectrum, and more. pose significant hurdles to safely operating and integrating AAM into our national airspace system. With the benefits promised by the technology and the challenges that remain, we need everyone at the table as soon as possible to start thinking through, working through, planning through these issues. That's exactly what this bill does, and I'm proud to support it. Again, I want to thank Vice Chair Sharice Davids for her leadership and partnership in sponsoring the bill. Mr. Chair, we can get ahead of the issues related to AAM and deliver benefits to the American public sooner if we act now, and this bill is a great place to start. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank both my vice chair, Representative Davids, and Mr. Graves, the ranking member of the Aviation Subcommittee, for their work on this. There is a tremendous opportunity here. I mean, the U.S. Has ceded too much to overseas, and if we can develop and integrate these vehicles into, United States airspace, safely, we can potentially become an exporter of that technology around the world. It is an extraordinarily interesting and innovative way to deal with congestion, which would be, a godsend for many, many, many Americans. I mean, this was, the Jetsons 30 years ago. It's, it's a reality now. A ranking member, Graves, talked about a manufacturer in his district, and I have one in Pendleton, Oregon, who's in advanced development of these vehicles. Obviously, we're going to have to go through full certification for their safety for those in the vehicles and obviously those on the ground below them. And so this bill would establish an interagency working group that would bring together the federal government, states, and localities. We don't want a patchwork because of the failures of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House and I guess the Commerce Committee in the Senate. We don't have federal standards on potential self-driving vehicles. So you're seeing a patchwork in the 50 states. That doesn't work. This would be us getting ahead of the problem and developing a thoughtful approach. I'm really pleased that we're taking that initiative. So federal government, states, localities, aerospace industry, labor unions, other stakeholders to plan and coordinate these to be safely integrated into our airspace system. There will be issues. We're also going to have small drones delivering packages. That low airspace is something we haven't spent, historically a lot of time developing the technology to deal with these things. Obviously, most of these are going to have their own sort of avoidance technologies on board, something like ADS-B in and out, I don't know. But there's still going to have to be oversight by the FAA. There's an incredibly long list of manufacturers and interest groups, which I won't read, who are supportive of the legislation. We held a hearing on this thanks to Representative Larson in April of this year, highlighting the potential extraordinary benefits for this industry, and I strongly support the legislation. Is there anyone on the Republican side who wishes to participate in general debate since we don't have two ranking members? Hearing none, I'd recognize Representative Larson, the chair of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm pleased to see the Bipartisan Advanced Air Mobility Coordination and Mobility Act is up for consideration. Right now, the U.S. aviation industry is undergoing an historic shift with the emergence of Advanced Air Mobility, or AAM. This legislation, prime-sponsored by Representative Davids and Representative Graves, fosters collaboration between federal agencies and civil aviation leaders on AAM principles, which will lead to safety, security, and frankly, a smarter investment in AAM. So as the nation works towards long-term economic recovery, we here in Congress can continue to have a forward-looking agenda on the future of U.S. aviation and aerospace, and AAM is part of that. So I want to thank Representative Davids and Representative Graves again. I want to thank Chair DeFazio and the committee staff for their work on this legislation, and encourage my colleagues to support this bill and continue to build the nation's aviation and aerospace industry. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I haven't looked, but I assume now there are 3 votes because I see we're having a motion to adjourn. So someone's upset about something. So there will be 3 votes. There's only 6 minutes left on the first vote, meaning hopefully just 11 minutes. So we will stand in recess until the conclusion of these votes and then return, and the first order of business will be amendments to this bill. With that, the committee stands in recess. Transportation Infrastructure Committee will come back to order. We will now proceed to amendments to the amendment, the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339. The first amendment is Perry 273. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339, offered by Mr. Perry, number 273.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Perry to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. This amendment requires the Secretary and FAA Administrator to coordinate with the groups that represent the interests of consumers and groups that represent the interest of taxpayers, in addition to those listed in the underlying bill. This critical taxpayer and consumer protection ensures there is an independent voice to inform the Secretary and the Administrator of the implication of items considered by the working group on the consumer and the taxpayer. This is vitally important given the mission of the working group to report recommendations regarding the safety, operations, security, cybersecurity, infrastructure, and other federal investment or actions necessary to support the evolution of the early AAM to higher levels of activity and societal benefits. Those footing the bill and those who will eventually be the end user of such systems should have a seat at the table. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment? Representative Graves, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to quickly say I believe that this amendment is an amendment that's in the best interest, that does improve the bill. I appreciate Mr. Perry bringing it up, and keep in mind that this is a consultation role. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Okay, I thank the gentleman for his brevity. Other members? Mr. Larson, do you want to speak?
Yes, I could. I'd like to address this amendment, Mr. Chair.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Aviation Subcommittee, just as we're moving forward on AAM, I think that this is important to have these groups represented on this committee. I think it's a good amendment, and I'll be supporting it. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members? Hearing none, I'll comment. We're all going to be surprised here. We're going to have unanimity on Mr. Perry's amendment. I support the amendment. You know, I believe it's a meritorious addition to the consultative group that we're establishing, including consumer interest groups and taxpayer representative groups. Will make certain that this is done prudently, it's affordable transportation, and that any federal funding is for the use, the benefit of taxpayers and not individual corporations. With that, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Any others wish to be heard? Are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none. If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor, if you're online, please unmute. Don't want to surprise you. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is Perry number 272. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339, offered by Mr. Perry, number 272.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Perry to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say I thank you for your consideration on the previous amendment. 272 requires that the Secretary and the FAA Administrator to coordinate with petroleum refineries, petroleum marketers, and the petrochemical manufacturing industry. While the bill does require coordination with the intended AAM operators, commercial airports, operators, airports, heliports, aviation training and maintenance providers, labor, state and local governments, environmental groups, utilities, energy providers, and UAS operators, it fails to include any representatives from the industry that fuels the vast majority of current operations and provides the feedstock for the components of nearly, if not all, aircraft. I do have concerns that this bill attempts to bake in the idea that the AAM must prioritize only electric aircraft rather than taking a technologically neutral approach. Without competing interest involved in the working group, groups coordination, there's a significant concern that electrification will be the only allowable choice, potentially precluding the adoption of a better, more efficient, more environmentally friendly alternative in the future. And so I ask for consideration and adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and with apologies to my good friend from Pennsylvania, it was almost too good to be true on the previous amendment. But on this one, I'm going to oppose it. We've had hearings on the issue of AAM, and it's not that there aren't a lot of issues we haven't explored, but largely the future of advanced air mobility has been focused on eVTOL, or electric vehicle takeoff and lift. And I don't recall, and it could be wrong, but I don't recall any proponents making an argument that AAM is going to be petroleum-based as much as it's going to be electricity-based. And that's sort of the reality of where the market in AAM is, in fact, headed. As well, I've got 2 refineries in my district. There's 2 more just north of me. None of the refiners in my district, and they're all major refineries, are clamoring on this issue. They have many other issues. This has not been a priority for them. This particular issue has not been a priority for them as well. So I just fail to see how it makes sense in this broader discussion about AAM. It is about innovation. It is about the future. And largely, it's been about electric vehicle takeoff and lift, not because we've made it so, but because the industry and the market has made it so. So I would ask folks to oppose this amendment. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Others wish to be heard. Ranking Member Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was really disappointed to hear Mr. Larson's comments. I thought we were on this new trajectory to do UC for all the Perry amendments. Look,
if I could, we're saving those for the Garrett Graves amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Mr. Perry continuing to try and ensure that all stakeholders are involved. Mr. Chairman, I just want to ask if there's a way for us to work through this. I think that we're all generally on the same page in terms of inclusion of appropriate folks, and if we can possibly try and figure out a path forward here where we try and make sure that the bill's intent is consistent with bringing the right people to the table. Yield to the chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. As the gentleman pointed out, section D1J, page 4, says energy providers. It is actually neutral in terms of the bill, and I would leave that to market forces to not specify or emphasize one particular provider of potential power for these vehicles over others, which might be hydrogen-based, might be green hydrogen. It might, a lot of the ones I've being developed in Oregon are electricity-based. Of course, we have plentiful electricity in the Pacific Northwest, and it's relatively inexpensive. So I don't see a reason to choose one over the other, since it says energy providers, fossil fuel companies, utilities, and others would all be included as energy providers. So I would urge the gentleman to potentially recognize that I think we have not excluded nor specifically included or emphasized one industry over the other. At your time, I yield back to you if you want to yield to Mr. Perry.
Yield to Mr. Perry.
Well, I thank the chairman, and I thank ranking member Mr. Graves for clarifying that for me and for all of us, and with your commitment, Mr. Chairman, on the energy providers language, that this will be addressed and not be weighted towards one technology or another, one energy source or another. With your commitment to working on that and being open to that, I will respectfully withdraw the amendment.
I yield, Chair.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, I'm not picking or choosing here. I'm going to leave it to market forces. I don't know about the ones in Garrett's district. The ones in Oregon are electricity-based. I've heard of others that are going to be hydrogen-based. There is brown hydrogen, there's green hydrogen. Some may well be fossil fuel-based. I don't know, and I don't think we should choose. So by including energy providers, everybody gets to compete. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
And also, I just want to make note, Mr. Chair, that in section D1, it also says, this is the preceding text, it says, Secretary of Transportation, the FAA Administrator shall coordinate with aviation industry and labor stakeholders, stakeholder associations, and others determined appropriate, and then including all these. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your willingness to work with Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry, I appreciate your willingness to continue working forward to make sure that the right people are at the table. Yield back.
Are there others who wish to speak to the amendment? Are there amendments? What? Oh, did he withdraw? I didn't hear him. Did you ask to withdraw? Oh, did you? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I missed that part. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I request you withdraw amendment number, let's make sure we get this right here. 272. 272, Mr. Gray.
All right. All right. I thank the gentleman. I'm sorry, I missed that part. The amendment's withdrawn. Are there further amendments? Hearing none, question is on the amendment, the nature of substitute as amended. All those in favor signify, wait, unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment, nature of substitute, is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 1339 as amended. The House of Representatives, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Ayes have it. The bill is amended, as amended, is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House.
I was muted. I don't know if it makes any difference because it was voice vote.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, and then come back and take this chair. That way we just keep it going, and I'll tag out with you.
Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3193,
I'm sorry, you say.
the E-Bridge Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, discharge from further consideration of H.R. 3193. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize, well, the clerk didn't designate.
No, it's no amendment. He doesn't have to.
Huh?
It's not an amendment. He doesn't have to designate.
Okay. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 3193. This was introduced by Ranking Member Graves, Representative Guest. Create a high-speed broadband initiative at the EDA, clarify that public-private partnerships consortiums are eligible for broadband project grant awards, access to reliable high-speed internet, vital for participation in today's workforce and economy, became way more apparent during this whole COVID crisis. Unfortunately, millions of the people in the country, including many in my district, still don't have access to high-speed internet. You know, my statewide 10%, my district is probably more like 30%. In order to effectively deploy broadband projects in the last mile, local communities must have flexibility to collaborate with public-private partnerships, consortiums, developing project proposals, EDA awards, grants. Committee are most of assistance, but many communities lack the financial technical resources. Clarifying public-private partnerships and consortiums are eligible. H.R. 3193 ensures that communities can leverage private sector experience without disqualifying them from receiving EDA assistance. The bill also provides grant applicants with additional flexibility in financing broadband infrastructure projects by clarifying that EDA funds can be combined with other federal resources and allowing real or personal property to count toward the non-federal shore. I strongly support the legislation, urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Mr. Guest, Representative Guest, for 5 minutes, a co-author of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Graves for his work on this important piece of legislation that will eliminate hurdles and leverage Economic Development Agency dollars to invest in broadband development across America's communities. By utilizing public-private partnerships and consortia between internet service providers and economic development agencies, EDA dollars could be leveraged to deploy broadband and spur modern economic development for rural and economically distressed communities. Many of these consortia exist within the private sector, including many large corporations working to deploy broadband across vast rural areas. However, EDA funds have been held back from small towns and communities working to attract private investment into their community. The eBridge Act would directly respond to the needs of these communities and provide flexibilities to leverage in-kind services and other federal resources. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the necessity of internet across our lives and the need to close the digital divide that exists between rural and urban America. This bill is supported by the App Association, American Farm Bureau, the National Association of Development Organizations. I appreciate the chairman for bringing this legislation forward in today's markup, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wish to be recognized? Hearing none, again, I'll just restate that I believe this would be a critical program for EDA to engage in. It will have benefits in my district. In fact, one small town in my district that was totally incinerated and obliterated by a fire trying to rebuild is working off some lame temporary cell towers, and if they could get broadband, which we're hopefully with the assistance of the state of Oregon going to get in, but it would be even better with EDA, who's actively involved in their recovery, if they could help. So this has tremendous merit, and I thank the two authors, Ranking Member Graves and Representative Guest. Any other members wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none. Are there any amendments to 3193? Hearing none. The question on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 3193 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed by nay. Aye. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. At this point, the committee will stand in recess until the return of Chair Larson. What? I now have 8 minutes. Well, there's one Democrat voting for it and one Republican, so, okay. All right, we'll move on. Our next item of consideration is H.R. 3037, Housing Survivors Major Disaster Acts 2021. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of 3037. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on 3037, introduced by Representatives Espaillat, Gonzalez Colon, rooted in the challenging disaster recoveries Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, legislation aimed at lessening bureaucratic burden placed on disaster survivors coming and registering for federal assistance. We have had similar problems on the mainland U.S. Otherwise qualified survivors can't register because they reside in homes handed down generation to generation, where there's no titling, or in other cases, the courthouse was wiped out and there are no records. FEMA has tried to work through these challenges, but efforts have been ad hoc, inconsistent. Bill formalizes the process. House did its job, passed this legislation last year. As usual, the pathetic Senate failed to act. I'm hopeful that with more time and new leadership, this bill will have a more fighting chance to be adopted by the Senate. It will also have an impact in my state. I highly recommend the legislation. With that, I would yield to Representative Guest. for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representative Espelot of New York and Ms. Gonzalez Colom of Puerto Rico for their work on this bill. This bill will remove red tape by requiring FEMA to consider alternative residency documents when providing housing assistance to areas struck by a natural disaster. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do other members wish to be recognized for statements on the bill? Hearing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 3037? Hearing none, the question on adoption, favorably reporting of H.R. 3037, the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is H.R. 3709, Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act of 2021. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Utilities, Emergency Grant, discharge further consideration of 3709. Call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement. This bill introduced by Representative Katko, former subcommittee ranking member, direct FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, produce a report examining the preliminary damage assessments or PDA process, establish more consistent training regime for FEMA personnel to effectively support these assessments. FEMA uses PDA findings in the wake of disaster, determine the extent of damage, subsequent unmet needs of individuals, business, public sector, and affected community. This would ensure greater consistency for PDA across FEMA's 10 regions by creating a training program. They are inconsistent now nationally and even within regions. I support this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Representative Guest for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Katko for introducing H.R. 3709 and urge support. We all know how important FEMA's preliminary disaster assessment is in determining eligibility for disaster assistance. This bill will ensure state and local stakeholders are involved in reviewing and developing recommendations for improving this process. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do other members wish to be heard? Hearing none. Are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none. The question is on the adoption favorably reporting of H.R. 3709 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. Bill is approved. Ordered favorably to the House.
Do you want to recess, or are you worried about votes?
Well, yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Okay, we got through 3.
Yeah, we got through 3. The rest will be
Okay.
easy.
The committee stands at recess.
Let's call the committee back into order. Next item up for business of the committee is HR 4679 to designate the federal building located at 1200 New Jersey Avenue Southeast in Washington, D.C. as the Norman Yoshio Mineta Federal Building. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged for further consideration of HR 4679, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll now recognize myself for a statement. HR 4679, which Representative DeFazio, Chair DeFazio introduced, names the Department of Transportation headquarters building in Washington, D.C. after our former colleague, Norm Mineta, and this recognition is long overdue. Secretary Mineta is a great American patriot. He, along with his family, suffered from the grave injustice of being forcibly relocated and interned during World War II. But he was not bitter towards his government. Instead, he spent his career serving his country by participating in and improving government. For almost 30 years, Norm represented San Jose, California on the city council, then as mayor, and then from 1975 to 1995 as a member of this body. He served on this committee, which was then called the Committee on Transportation and Public Works, throughout his entire time in Congress. He chaired the Subcommittee on Aviation and the Subcommittee on Surface Transportation, and he chaired the full committee for one term. He was a primary author of the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, or ICE-T, which, as President George H.W. Bush said during the signing ceremony, was, quote, the most important transportation bill since President Eisenhower started the interstate system 35 years ago. This bill, said President Bush, also means investment in America's economic future for an efficient transportation system. It's essential for a productive and efficient economy. The future of the American transportation begins today. Norm's skills and accomplishments were widely recognized. He was President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Commerce and President George W. Bush's Secretary of Transportation, where he was the longest-serving Secretary of Transportation in U.S. history. Following the terrorist acts of September 11, 2001, Secretary Mineta guided the creation of the Transportation Security Administration, an agency with more than 65,000 employees, the largest mobilization of a new federal agency since World War II. For his contributions to this committee, to this institution, to our government, and to the field of transportation, Secretary Mineta deserves this recognition. So please support in honoring our friend and colleague, Norm Mineta. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Norm Mineta served as a distinguished member of this committee for many years, including as ranking member and chairman. Went on to serve as Secretary of Transportation under the George W. Bush administration. And a little bit closer to home, Miss Lynn Dunstan, who works in our Baton Rouge office and is a guru on all things veterans. She actually worked for Secretary Mineta, and I know holds him in very high regard. So, Mr. Chairman, yield back. Now it's time.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Do any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Hearing none. Are there any amendments to HR 4679? No amendments? So now we'll move to final passage. The question is on the adoption and favorably reporting of HR 4679 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor, be prepared to unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is HR 4660 to designate the federal building and the U.S. courthouse located at 1125 Chaplain Street in Wheeling, West Virginia as a Frederick P. Stamp Jr. federal building and United States courthouse. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of HR 4660, and I call up the bill now for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 4660. H.R. 4660 designates the federal building located at 1125 Chapline Street in Wheeling, West Virginia as the Frederick P. Stamp Jr. Federal Building and Courthouse. The legislation was introduced by Congressman David McKinley of West Virginia. Representative McKinley has long sought this designation to honor Judge Stamp's career and legacy. Judge Stamp was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Washington and Lee University and a law degree from the University of Virginia. He was a private in the U.S. Army from 1959 to 1960 and a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserves from 1960 to 1967. Judge Stamp was in private practice in Wheeling from 1960 to 1990. Judge Stamp's service to this community, to his state, and to the judicial system is widely respected. I support H.R. 4460 and urge my colleagues to join me. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge support for H.R. 4660, which was introduced by our colleague, Mr. McKinley from West Virginia. H.R. 4660 names the federal building and courthouse in Wheeling, West Virginia after federal judge Frederick P. Stamp Jr. I support the bill and yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Do any other members wish to be recognized for a statement? Are there any amendments to H.R. 4660? Hearing none, now the question is on the adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 4660 to the House of Representatives. Please unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 2220 to amend Title 40 U.S. Code to modify the treatment of certain bargain price options to purchase at less than fair market value and for other purposes. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged for further consideration of H.R. 2220, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on H.R. 220. H.R. 220, introduced by Representative Guest, Webster, and Pence, requires GSA to secure a congressional appropriation before it can exercise a pre-negotiated purchase option in an operating lease. Currently, OMB rules stipulate that a lease cannot be considered as an operating lease if it contains a pre-negotiated bargain price purchase option. Operating leases allow agencies to budget their rent outlays annually, whereas capital leases require the agency to budget upfront the entire net present value of all rental obligations it will incur over the duration of the lease term. Unless GSA has full upfront appropriations on hand, the agency must rely on operating leases that can be paid for year by year. But preventing an operating lease from containing a pre-negotiated bargain price purchase option means that if GSA wants to acquire the building at the end of the lease, the agency must pay fair market value. Instead of negotiating a sales price at the beginning of the lease, when the landlord is anxious to lock in a lease with the federal government, and before the value of the land is increased because the federal investment has supported a neighborhood revitalization, the federal government is required to pay for the building twice, once when it leases the building and once when it purchases the building at the end of the lease at the current market rate. OMB rules are designed to ensure that ownership risk stays with the lessor and that the lease isn't a mechanism through which the government finances its ownership of the property. But the effect is that the federal government is overpaying for buildings and not getting the benefit of equity that it has created for private sector landlords. I support this legislation. It was included in the H.R. 4487, that is the Public Buildings Reform and Savings Act of 2016. Support it again, and it's time to give GSA flexibility it needs to make savvy financial deals for the federal government. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 2220 and thank Representative Guest the subcommittee ranking member Webster for their leadership on this issue. The simple purpose of the bill is to save taxpayers money by aligning GSA leasing authority with scoring rules that are that Congress has to deal with to help negotiate discounted prices and discounted options in leasing. This has been a public buildings priority for this committee for some time, and I'm pleased that we can act on this today. Mr. Chairman, I want to make one last note on this. There is a similar scoring issue related to VA leases that is preventing a number of better healthcare solutions for our veterans around the country from being realized because of simply the bureaucracy of how scoring is handled within the Congress that is preventing our veterans from getting better healthcare facilities. And so again, I want to commend Mr. Guest, Mr. Webster, and others that worked on this legislation, but we still have some work to do. I urge adoption of this legislation and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members wish to be recognized for a statement? Mr. Guest, Mississippi Representative, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2220 would allow the General Service Administration, known as the GSA, to enter into bargain price purchasing agreements in situations when the buying of federal property is the cheaper alternative to a long-term lease. Designed as a measure to bring free market efficiency into federal real estate, the legislation would save taxpayer dollars from costly long-term lease contracts where bargain purchases better suit the situation. In the GSA resolutions we will take up later in this markup, the Tacoma Union Station request shows the benefit of allowing these bargain price purchases. Prior to scoring rule changes, the GSA negotiated a $1 purchase of the facility in order to undertake necessary seismic and building system modifications. By purchasing the property, the GSA will be investing the needed investment to modernize the facility for federal use while realizing a lease cost avoidance of approximately $6.4 million in protecting taxpayer dollars. This is a common sense correction and will continue this committee's work in reducing the taxpayer's burden in federal real estate. I appreciate the chairman and ranking member for including this legislation in today's markup, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Is there any other members wish to be recognized? Hearing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 2220? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of favorably reporting of H.R. 220 to the House of Representatives. Please unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered favorably to the U.S. House of Representatives. The chair recognizes the chair of the full committee out of order for a statement. The chair is recognized for as much as he may consume.
I thank the gentleman for his recognition. I understand while I was overvoting, you read my statement about naming the DOT headquarters for former Secretary and former Representative Norm Mineta. You know, I served with Norm for many years on this committee. He started, I think when I came in, he was chair of aviation, ultimately became chair of the full committee. You know, he was a great mentor. He went on to serve in 2 administrations as Secretary of Transportation, one Democratic and one Republican, which is an extraordinary record of service. And I believe that this recognition of Representative, former Secretary Mineta is, you know, is entirely warranted. And I appreciate my colleagues for having supported the bill while I was absent. And I'm looking forward to it being taken up under suspension on the floor. And hopefully that's a suspension that someone won't call for a vote on. But if they do, I'm sure we will prevail. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank the chair.
Two
All right.
quick ones.
All right.
And you don't have to read everything.
All right, our next item for consideration is H-Con Res 41, authorizing the use of Capitol grounds for the National Peace Officers Memorial Service and National Honor Guard and Pipe Band Exhibition. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H-Con Res 41, and I call the resolution up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with, and the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this point, I recognize Representative Titus, Chair of the Subcommittee, for a statement on the resolution. Representative Titus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. House Concurrent Resolution 41 authorizes the use of the Capitol grounds for the annual National Police Officers Memorial Service and the National Honor Guard and Pipe Band Exhibition. As chair of the subcommittee, as you mentioned, it's my honor to carry this resolution along with the support of my ranking member, Mr. Webster. Both events will be coordinated with the architect of the Capitol and with the Capitol Police. And this year will honor 394 officers whose names were added to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial earlier this year. The event is typically held each year in May, coinciding with the festivities of Police Week. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic and security concerns surrounding the Capitol, this year's event will take place in October. The memorial, which is located here in Washington, recognizes those in law enforcement who made the ultimate sacrifice. Of the 394 men and women being memorialized this year, 182 of them, sadly, died as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are among the millions of frontline and essential workers who day in and day out risk their lives and their families' lives to keep us safe. They were treating the sick, keeping our cities and towns running, stocking grocery shelves, cooking meals, and delivering products so many of us could stay at home and stop the spread of this deadly virus. We can't bring back those that we've lost, but we can honor their sacrifice and take basic steps to keep ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities safe. That's the least that we owe them. I want to briefly note 3 names that were added to the memorial this year who hail from my state of Nevada. There's Henderson Police Department Patrolman Marvin Leroy Scott, who passed away from a heart attack following his interceding in a fight in a local bar. He was a veteran of both the Korean and Vietnam Wars and had served in law enforcement upon his return for only 2 years before passing away. Nevada Highway Patrol Sergeant Benjamin Michael Jenkins of Elko, Nevada, was shot and killed by an assailant when he stopped to help the person with the car who had broken down by the side of the road. That he was being a good Samaritan, and the person who had ties with anti-government extremism shot him on the spot. Sergeant Jenkins was the epitome of a public servant, having spent 21 years working for the state of Nevada, including for the state's fire marshal and the Division of Forestry before joining the Highway Patrol. He also had served in both the Air and Army National Guards and was a firefighter, a volunteer firefighter who had earned his EMT license. Finally, Lieutenant Eric Larson Lloyd of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department passed away from complications of COVID on July 29th, 2020, just this year. He came to Southern Nevada in 1987 to attend the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he studied hospitality management and criminal justice. In 1990, following his graduation, Lieutenant Lloyd joined the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, where he proudly served our community in uniform. These are just some examples of the kind of heroes who will be memorialized in this service. My condolences are with their families and loved ones. These are 3 brave public servants, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. We must mourn the loss of the 394 brave men and women who will be recognized, and I hope that all members of the committee will join me in doing so by supporting this tribute to our fallen law enforcement officers. And I yield back.
Representative yields back. Recognize Representative Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Webster and Chair Titus for offering this resolution. The National Peace Officers Memorial events honor law enforcement officers who make the ultimate sacrifice each year. And this measure authorizes the use of Capitol grounds for those events. Tragically, in 2020, we had 295 fallen officers. Mr. Chairman, I'll say that again. 2020, we had 295 fallen officers. When you think about the impacts on the families and the communities across America, that number is exponentially higher in terms of the impacted members of our nation. These men and women put on the uniforms each day to serve and protect our communities and families at a time when our law enforcement officers have come under political and physical attack. It's important that this committee speak loud and clear that the vast majority of police officers are good people doing a tough job day in and day out to keep us safe. To all law enforcement officers who put their badge on each day and wear it with honor, we say thank you. Mr. Chairman, in my home town of Baton Rouge, we just had our 5th anniversary of an awful shooting of a number of officers involving some of our Baton Rouge Police Department and our East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office. We had Deputy Garofalo, we had Montrell Jackson, and we had Matthew Gerald, who all were killed from a senseless, just awful attack by a really bad person. We had Chad Montgomery, Bruce Simmons, and Nick Touye, who all were shot as well. In fact, I just ran into Chad Montgomery the other day, just a few weeks ago, and spoke to him. But Nick Touye has been fighting for his life for over 5 years, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say it again, thank you to all the law enforcement officers across the country. This resolution, just one way, can demonstrate our support for these officers and their families and honor those who have lost their lives in the line of duty. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution and yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative. Any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Are there any amendments to H-Con Res 41? Hearing none, the questions on the adoption and favorable reporting of H-Con Res 41 to the House of Representatives. All those, please unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The bill's approved and reported favorably to the House. We'll now consider 12 General Service Administration or GSA Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions and ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc, and they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Just quickly, I do support the 12 GSA resolutions before us today. 11 of these resolutions provide GSA with authorization needed to undertake needed repairs and alterations to secure and or replace life safety, fire protection, seismic, structural and mechanical, electrical, water, and roof systems in GSA-owned and leased buildings around the country. 3 of those alteration projects are in the districts of T&I members, Mr. Brown of Maryland, Mr. Kahele of Hawaii, and Mr. Carson of Michigan. I support these resolutions, urge my colleagues to do the same, and I recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for working with us on a bipartisan basis. These 12 GSA resolutions include savings of in excess of $161 million for taxpayers in reducing rental rates in space. I urge adoption of the resolutions and yield back.
All right, before I recognize members for, if there's any members for statement, I want to remind folks there is a vote on, and we would like to complete this resolution in the committee hearing before the vote. And so, do any other members wish to be recognized for statements? Are there any, that's fine. Are there any amendments to the en bloc resolutions? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of the 12 GSA resolutions en bloc. Please unmute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the 12 resolutions are approved. I now ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical clarifying and conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair or designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chair, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provisions of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee, or that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to Budget Act or Rule 21 PAYGO point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business, and the committee is now adjourned.